Hey everybody, welcome to this discussion, or basically a conversation, or a story, literally, about how BDCs in Nigeria has changed in terms of distribution regionally. That is, how it has changed from before March 1st, on the 1st of March, the CBN issued a press release that it will be revoking the licenses of more than 4,000 BDCs in Nigeria. And essentially, what I'm doing is extracting the data from the former list, that is the list before 1st of March, and also the list after the revocation, and comparing it and literally looking at the data and allowing the data to speak and to tell me, okay, what's happening, what does Nigeria look like at this point in time, and essentially, what does that mean for the different people that might be affected in this. Before I go further, however, there are certain things that are important to note when analyzing this data, especially when I was going through this process. The first thing is that, yes, though, there were 5,690 BDCs in the official list. That is, if you go to the CBN's list of financial institutions, where you will find all the list of the BDCs. I think it's still there as of today. I checked some days back in March, and it was still available. So if you still have that chance to look at it, you'll see that there were approximately 5,690 BDCs in Nigeria. But of course, when you actually clean the data, you will discover that you can only account for 5,682 BDCs. That is because there are about 8 BDCs that you cannot precisely place to a particular location, and in that case, that will make that particular BDC an invalid data, and it would just be wrong to use that data for analysis. The other thing that should be taken into account when you're listening to me and when I'm analyzing this data is that when it comes to the revoked list, there are certain errors, right, that were in the list itself. I mean, of course, in the CBN's own press release, they stated that 4,173 BDCs were revoked. But when you start to do the proper analysis, you discover that about 79 BDCs can't actually be used or analyzed. And why? Well, first of all, because there were 12 duplicate BDCs. That is, there were 12 BDCs essentially that appeared twice, and in that case, it was just redundant and so had to be removed from the entire list. And this is because, of course, the BDCs has the same name, and so therefore, I just removed them from the data, from the analysis altogether. And also, the second aspect is that there were about 66 BDCs that do not appear in the original list. Now, this raises certain questions, which is that, where does the CBN get the names of these 66 BDCs? Why are they not included in the original list? That is the list before the 1st of March. That is the list that's actually available on the CBN currently, if it has not been removed yet. I mean, I have it. I downloaded it before if it was removed, or if it's still there, the one that's still there. So that's what I'm talking about, right? Why are the BDCs not there, right? Further questions need to be asked in that sense. And also, we have to also ask ourselves, are there other BDCs that exist that are licensed, perhaps, right, that the CBN did not tell us about in the official list, which essentially will mean that there are actually more than 5,682 BDCs, essentially. Anyways, at the end of the day, the entire point is that there are just some errors in the data, not so much, honestly, and it's important to take note of that for doing the analysis. So I'm standing by my methodology and my process. If you think that, oh no, it's wrong, then you have to prove me wrong in how I did it, and also you have to show me a better way of analyzing the two lists. If not, I believe that this process I used is the better process. Anyways, guys, let's move on to the actual analysis and the story that the data is telling us. So if you are interested in reading the entire analysis, you can head over to my LinkedIn. That's Musa Obed, and you will literally find the post on this analysis, and it's called A Data Story of BDCs in Nigeria. It's an article that I published on the 19th of March 2024. All right, we might be here for a while, but I promise you will actually enjoy this entire process and this entire analysis. So BDCs in Nigeria. Well, first of all, the first thing you have to realize that why are BDCs important? Well, BDCs are important essentially because you have to change money. Like, people have to change money, and banks just do not have the capacity to change that much money, because banks have restrictions which CBN has placed on them in how much they can give, when they can give it, and all of that, etc. You can find the restrictions in like different guidelines by the CBN, which literally guides banks into, this is what you should do, this is what you should not do, etc. So in a situation whereby I go to a bank, let's say Diamond Bank, right, and I tell Diamond Bank, my child, like, I need to pay school fees for my son or my daughter, or whatever, I need to pay for my business products, whatever it may be. In that case, and Diamond is like, yeah, that's fine, like, we take your request, and first week Diamond does not respond to you, second week Diamond does not respond to you. Like, your child is literally in the UK or Australia or wherever that person may be, waiting for funds to come, and you can't literally wait for Diamond Bank. So what do? You go to like alternatives, who are in quotes the BDC exchanges, and you tell them that, I want this amount of dollar, let's say $5,000, right, and I'll give you naira for that, and so essentially that is honestly the main point of BDCs in Nigeria, and that is their major usefulness. I know people like also use a lot exchange money these days to preserve the value of their money, especially taking into account inflation in Nigeria. We'll talk about inflation at the end, in the conclusion of this analysis, but there are people that also use it. Technically, what we call that is hoarding, right? You're keeping money because you believe the value will go up. So it can be intentional hoarding and unintentional hoarding. By intentional hoarding, I mean that the value will go up. That is why you are actually keeping, the dollars. And by keeping the dollars, you are making the dollars more scarce, in the sense of, you are making it seem as if there are less dollars in circulation in Nigeria than actually is, right? You don't want to show that you have dollars, so the demand will look higher and the supply will look lower. And then unintentional hoarding is essentially people that want to preserve the value of their naira, but without their own knowledge, they are actually doing the first thing I said, which is basically you are keeping the dollars, and as a result, right, affecting demand and supply, etc. Now that we kind of understand the importance of BDCs in Nigeria, let me also explain that all of this, right, the entire BDC issue, or their prominence or relevance, if you like, in Nigeria, actually can be traced to the period of Godwin Emefiele's regime. Now, I have written a mini report on Godwin Emefiele's regime, like CBN regime. You have to pay for that, I'm sorry, for that mini report, but it's in my LinkedIn. If you go to my LinkedIn, you'll see the link. I might also put like a description below, just so that you have access to it if you're interested to like pay for it. I read the reports, but in that mini report, essentially what we see is that the dollars was subsidized in Nigeria. That is because the CBN governor, that is Mr. Godwin Emefiele, or Governor Godwin Emefiele as at that point, did not want to allow the real value of the naira to be reflected in the market. What he did literally, right, was to pay up the difference of how much dollars the naira was being protected against. That is, if, let's say, the naira's real value in the market, and how do you, hypothetically speaking, how do you actually know the naira's real value in a market, right? Well, you go to a market, and essentially, let's imagine you go to, I don't know, Smurf's canteen, right? And in Smurf's canteen, they sell chocolates, right? And so the owner of Smurf's canteen, you come to him with naira, right? And then the owner of Smurf's canteen says, oh, to get this chocolate in Smurf's canteen, you have to pay 5,000 naira, right? And of course, you will have to, if you really want that chocolate, you will have to pay that value. If not, you can't have the chocolate in essence, right? And let's imagine that you also come with dollars, and you ask the Smurf's canteen owner, like, oh, okay, but if I'm paying dollars, how much should I pay? And the owner of Smurf's canteen tells you, oh, you pay $5, right? So essentially what that means is that for each dollar, right, you are paying 1,000 naira. And so $5 means that you're paying 5,000 naira. What happened during the Mr. Godwin Emefiele regime was that when you go to the owner of Smurf's canteen, you are literally paying 400, 500 naira for the chocolate, as opposed to the 1,000 or 5,000 that you're supposed to pay, right? What does that mean, right? Of course, you already know what that means. If you think about it, is that difference of 500 or 400, that had to be like that literally you had to pay unknowingly, right, was being paid for by the central bank. And so in the same way that we actually had a fuel subsidy, we also simultaneously had a foreign exchange subsidy, which, you know, like, cost us a lot of money. And that was why on the 1st of May in 2023, when President Tinubu was elected, you know, like, one of the first things he did after, you know, like, the whole removing subsidy of oil, was also like devaluing the naira, which essentially is the same thing as ensuring that when you go to the owner of Smurf's canteen, you are able to buy chocolate for 5,000 and not 2,500, which is like half of the price. Now that we have understood this context, and now that, you know, we understand a bit, you know, where we are coming from, let's actually head over to BDCs in Nigeria. Our advice, if you're listening to this, perhaps if you can, right, look at the graphs that I show in my LinkedIn post. So figure 1, figure 2, figure 3, and like the table subsequently, to give you'll be able to see a clear picture. You don't necessarily need it, because I'll be explaining everything in this podcast, but, you know, if you are a visual person and you want to just have like visual aid, just do that, and to help you a lot in terms of understanding. Okay, so BDCs in Nigeria. First, I'm going to break into 3. I'm going to break our story into, okay, BDCs before 1st of March, that is before the CBN came out and said, oh, we're revoking 4,000 plus BDCs in Nigeria. Then I'm going to talk about, the revocation in itself, that is the BDCs that were revoked. And then I'm going to talk about, post revocation, like how is the BDCs distributed across Nigeria after CBN revoked the licenses, right, from the 1st of March 2024. When we look at the first aspect, which is like the data story of, BDCs in Nigeria before the revocation, that is before the 1st of March 2024, we see clearly, a story about 3 states. That's the truth of the matter. It's really a story about Lagos, Abuja, and Kano state, as the 3 of them literally were composed of 90% of BDCs in the country. That is in Kano, Lagos, and Abuja, that's the Federal Capital Territory, FCT. 90% of BDCs in the entire Nigeria were concentrated, which is like heavy concentration at the end of the day. Lagos precisely had Lagos had 2,956 BDCs. That is like 52% of all the BDCs. More than half of the BDCs in the country were situated in Lagos. Abuja had 1,178 BDCs. That is 20%, 20.7% of the BDCs in the country. Whereby Kano State had 980 BDCs in the country, or 17.2% of the entire BDCs in the country, right? And when we start to look at, but how, like Lagos, Abuja, and Kano actually have a lot, but what does it look like when you look at like the regions in Nigeria? I'm not a fan of geopolitical zones. I just think we should just remove the geopolitical, like political in the geo. Just say zones in Nigeria. Geopolitical always gives it attention that's unnecessary. But when we look at those zones, right, that's north central, northeast, northwest, southeast, south, and southwest. What essentially we see is that in the north central, the north central had 21% of the BDCs in the country. The northeast had just 0.3%. That's less than 1%, 0.3%. 20 BDCs essentially in the northwest. In the entire country, the north central, by the way, had 1,198 BDCs. If you are asking yourself what states are in the north central, just go on Google and check it. Or like any of the regions. I think it's just waste my time if I'm calling them each one by one. So the northeast, 20 BDCs or 0.3%. The northwest had 1,060 BDCs or 18.6%. That is where Kano is located. The Abuja of the FCT, by the way, is located in the north central, where 21% of the BDCs are located. And then the southeast, has 349 BDCs or 6.1%. The south side had 64 BDCs or 1.1%. And then the southwest, where Lagos is located, had 2,991 BDCs or 52.6% of all the BDCs in the country. This was all, before the revocation press release of the 1st of March. And obviously what we see is that, if you have Kano, Abuja, or Lagos State, literally like your regional share will go up. And just because you're located there, essentially, that's it. There's really no mathematics to it. And then another important thing we should take note of is, how many states actually did not have BDCs at all? And to answer this question, I'll also divide it regionally. So in the north central, there's actually no states that did not have one BDC, like at least one BDC. That is, in every of the north central states, there was at least one BDC in each of the states, right? The same is true like for the southeast, and the same is true also for the south. In the northeast, however, there were 3 states before the 1st of March that did not have any BDC whatsoever. That is Adamawa State, Taraba, and Yobe States. In the northwest, there were 2, Jigawa State and Zamfara State, and in the southwest, there were also 3, Ekiti States, Ondo State, and Osun States. So, of course, all of them literally make up 8 states, I think. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yes, 8 states. Literally, there were 8 states in Nigeria that were without BDCs before the 1st of March, right? What does it mean? What are the implications? Well, essentially, if you're a resident in that state, like if I am a resident in Zamfara State, it essentially means that like my only possibility of exchanging money, like dollars, is the bank. Officially licensed BDC. Of course, we know that there are some accounts that literally hold dollars, but are not official licensed BDCs. But I'm only looking at the official licensed BDCs at that point. And if my state is one of the states that does not have BDCs, essentially I have to go to the banks and I have to wait for their waiting times, etc. Literally, I have no alternative whatsoever. And if I do not have, for example, any of the big 3, that is Kano, Lagos, or Abuja, around me, right? It's kind of like a bad situation, and that is precisely the situation of the northeast. So in the northeast, like you literally have to move far, or like, have contacts in different places to be able to exchange your dollars, or to exchange your naira for dollars or dollars to naira, etc. So that's what it means, like, not to have states, and those are the implications. When you're looking at why is not having a BDC in your state important. At the same time, like you can ask yourself, well, do these states actually need it? I mean, obviously they do, because like, I want to believe that everybody, like, there's at least one person in every state that wants to change, like, the naira for the dollars or the dollars for naira, and it just presents more difficulty for these individuals at the end of the day. Another important thing I do in my analysis is that I remove, so because I want to like also understand the story in different ways, I also remove the influence of Lagos, Kano and Abuja from their respective regions. That is, I also look at the data when we remove these big three from their respective regions. And when we do that, right, Nigeria only has 568 BDCs. That is, if you remove Lagos, if you remove Kano, and if you remove Abuja, there are only 568 BDCs. And 6 out of 10 of these BDCs are located in the southeast region, who have 349 BDCs in the country, taking into account that these big three are removed. Also, the southwest, that is where Lagos would have been situated, right, will only have 35 BDCs. The north central will only have 20, and the north, that is where Abuja is located, and the northwest will only have 80 BDCs, or 14% of the BDCs. When we now look at what's actually the influence of these big three on the regions, well, the influence of Lagos in southwest, that is the influence of, or like the share of BDCs in Lagos states relative to the southwest, that is when you compare it to all the other states in the southwest, is 98.8%. That is 98.8% of all the BDCs that are located in the southwest are in Lagos State. When you look at the northwest, it's 92.4% of all the BDCs in the northwest are located in Kano State. And when you look at like the north central region, 98.3% of all the BDCs in the north central region is located in FCT. So of course, like, we see like a big dominance of these big three within their respective states. So that is literally like the first story we have to know and we have to remember. So we have clearly stated that the big three, that's Lagos, Kano and Abuja, influence a lot. We have also shown that if you remove it, right, like you remove these three states, like most of the concentration will actually be in the southeast region. And the southeast region, by the way, is where Abia, Anambra, Ebonyi, Enugu and Imo states are located. So kind of business driven places, right? So that's what it will look like. That's what the data will show you when you do that. Now I will be moving to the data story after the CBN revoked the BDC licenses. That is, the 1st of March 2024 release. That is the press release and the confirmation of the revocation of 4,000 plus BDCs in the country. But before doing that, I will just state that the CBN revoked the licenses for 3 reasons, according to them, right? So they stated that either the BDC, right, who was formerly licensed, that is the BDC that was amongst the 5,000 plus BDCs that existed in the country before and was licensed in the country before, there were one of 3 things that it did not do. So the first is that, that particular BDC did not pay all the necessary fees, and this includes, renewal, license renewal fee, within the stipulated time in the guidelines, that is in the CBN guidelines. And then the second one is the rendition of returns in line with the guidelines, that is how much you're supposed to give back in line with the CBN guidelines. And the third thing is that it will, these BDCs that were revoked either did not also comply with the guidelines in general when it comes to anti-money laundering, countering the financing of terrorism, or counter proliferation financing, essentially. So kind of the things that enhance, if you like, insecurity in Nigeria, and also just if you live in Abuja or Lagos, right, really skyrockets the real estate industry at the end of the day. So these were the three reasons that the CBN gave why they revoked the licenses of more than 4,000 BDCs in the country. An interesting thing, however, right, is that if you are familiar with the space, or if you have been following the CBN for a while, either because the CBN is touching you and it literally affects you, or just out of interest, curiosity, or keeping up to date, you remember that like on February 23rd, right, the CBN had released an exposure draft, which literally was a revised guideline for BDCs. Right now, what I do not know is if they are using this guideline. If you're listening to this and you know this answer, please let me know. Is if they're using this particular guideline to actually influence the decision they made on March 1st, or whether the decision they made on March 1st was already concluded even before the release of this particular February 23rd exposure draft. Now, why is this important? This is important because they literally only gave 1 week to the BDC. So if February 23rd exposure draft influenced, it means that the CBN only gave 1 week to BDCs to comply and change. And honestly, that is a bit unfair in my opinion if that is the case. But if that is not the case, then well, all is fine. What are important things that perhaps we should know from the exposure draft? Well, the first important thing that we should know, I just list out 3 when I'm talking about the exposure draft in my article, and that's what I'll focus on. The first important thing that we should know is that non-resident foreigners, governments, as like state government at the 3 levels, as like state government, local government, federal government, commercial banks, merchant banks, no interest banks, and payment service banks, that's PSBs, are not allowed to own BDCs anymore, according to the CBN. That is, if you are a foreigner and you do not stay in Nigeria, you can't have BDCs. State governments can't have BDCs, local governments can't have BDCs, and the federal government cannot have BDCs. Also, if you are a bank, that is, you're a commercial bank, you're a merchant bank, you're a non-interest bank, or you're a payment service bank, which previously a lot of them had BDCs. If you look at the former list, like the original list, that's before the revocation on the 1st of March, a lot of them had BDCs, right? So they literally, the CBN just said, you know what, guys, no BDCs for you guys again. The second thing that's important, from this exposure draft is the fact that sale and purchase of dollars at BDCs above $500 dollars cannot be made in cash. That is it must be done electronically. Like the money, the dollars will be sent to you electronically. And I'm guessing that one of the reasons is because they want to be able to convert your dollar or to naira, right? That is, if it's sent electronically, that means it is in a bank. And if it is in a bank, right, that means this CBN can technically control it because it will be under a licensed bank, right? You will not just keep your money, your dollars, in an unsafe place. It's gonna be either in the GT Bank, Monument Bank, like UB or whatever, dumb accounts, right? And if that is the case, then the CBN has more control and a better ability to decide how monies can be used in that extent. So this limiting is actually smart in the extent that it forces people to actually just be compliant. If before you did not care what the CBN said, well, now there's a limit. You literally go to the BDC's guy and he's like, oh no, I can't give you more than 500, right? But I can send it to you. Well, and if you have to have it sent to you, well, then the money is registered in your own account. It is part of your your account statements now. And if they need to check anything, well, now it's literally with you. So that's also another thing that the CBN said. And then finally, with this exposure draft that was released on 23rd of February 2024, the CBN has now tiered its licenses. That is, it has now created like levels to its licenses. So there's the tier 1 license and there's the tier 2 license. The tier 1 license allows, the license holders to operate around the nation and have branches and franchises. That is, if you're tier 1, you're technically like having the complete package. Like you have everything that was before this exposure draft was released. But if you're at tier 2 now, that's where the things change. You literally have to only function in one state, right? And you can only have a maximum of 3 offices within that state. So of course, like that limits you considerably, and that kind of also allows the CBN to control your activities. Of course, this is a story, as you can see already, like it's a story about control. It's a story about CBN trying to manage how money is moved, for what reasons, for different reasons, like for different reasons within the economy and for different reasons within society. Like I don't want to spill too much now, because at the conclusion I will just highlight the plots and like what exactly this data is telling us and what we should remember essentially. So I'll just tone it down here as regarding like what the CBN is trying to do, and I'll just move quickly to the revocation list. That is the 4,000 plus BDCs that were actually BDC licenses that were actually revoked on the 1st of March 2023. If you actually want to it's a one pager, it's not that long. That is the release, the press release itself. You can just check CBN on Google, like CBN revoke BDCs revoke list, or CBN BDCs press release March 1st, and you'll find it. But essentially, what are we seeing from the revoked list? Well, a lot. By a lot I mean that like the CBN literally brought a heavy hammer on BDCs, and the heavy hammer is still like on the big 3, that is Kano, Abuja, and Lagos State. Just to put some numbers, Lagos literally had 2,213 BDCs licenses revoked. That is just cleaned out. Literally, BDCs that existed before have now been revoked. In Abuja, that is 967 BDCs were revoked. And in Kano, there was about 605 BDCs whose licenses was revoked. In total, like in the entire Nigeria, the amount of licenses that were revoked actually is 4,094. I've explained why it's 4,094 and not like the 4,173 I think that the CBN says in their list, because they're just duplicates and like just some of the BDCs could not be accounted for. So that's why it's, in my analysis, it's 4,094 BDCs whose licenses were revoked. What is the share? Well, it's also literally driven by the big 3, that's Lagos, Abuja, and Kano State. And Lagos, accounts for 54% of all the BDCs all the BDC licenses that were revoked. This is also because like they just had the most BDCs at the end of the day, so it's reasonable. I don't think it's like political or anything. They just had the most, and if you want to remove licenses, well, the biggest might be affected the most equally. When it comes to Net Central, where Abuja is located, 23.9% of their BDCs were literally removed and cleared. 23.9% of all the BDCs removed in the country came from the North Central, and then in Kano, that is Northwest, that is 15.8% of all the BDCs removed came from the Northwest region. When we remove the big 3, that is Lagos State, Kano State, and Abuja, what we see is that, well, the Southeast is still the region that has the most licenses that were revoked. That is, if you remove these big 3, which states or which regions actually had most of their licenses revoked? Well, the data tells you that it's the Southeast, right? The Southeast has had 166 of their BDCs revoked, like licenses revoked. That's 53.7% of the nation's total, which essentially, is also a large number if you're not considering Lagos, Abuja, and Federal Capital Territory, that's Abuja, and Kano, sorry. And if you remove these three, the amount of BDCs that were literally revoked, that is, if you remove Lagos State, if you remove Kano, and if you remove Abuja, there were only 309 licenses that were revoked within like Nigeria, based on the press release on the 1st of March. Who was the biggest hit, right? Literally from this, based on the big three, that is Lagos, Abuja, and Kano. Well, the biggest hit is Abuja. Abuja lost its 2% of its BDCs because of that press release, followed by Lagos State, which lost 74.8% of its BDCs based on that press release, and then followed by Kano State, which lost 61.7% of its BDCs. I mean, the assumption I'm making here is that, Kano might actually be more compliant. Maybe that's why. But of course, I've already mentioned that. I don't know if, it's because of, like, the CBN is using the February 23rd guidelines to revoke the licenses, or that is like giving them 1 week literally to revoke the licenses, or days in that case, right? Or they are using like the previous one, which is like the 2015 guidelines for BDCs to revoke the licenses. But in either case, Abuja lost its 2% of its BDCs, Lagos lost 74.8% of its BDCs, and Kano State lost 61.7% of its BDCs in the process. So Kano technically in this case, have more compliant BDCs. That's what we can say technically from what has happened since the 1st of March. Does that mean, that the other BDCs are not compliant? Well, I mean, I don't know is the true question, right? Because it's either one of the three reasons that the CBN gave, that is, you are doing money laundering or counterterrorism, or you did not return like the fees, or you did not do the proper renewal process. So like, we don't know which of the three reasons each of the BDCs were revoked for, right? But we just know that they were revoked for one of the three reasons. So technically the assumption is that yes, Kano has better complying BDCs that are more compliant to the CBN, but we don't know like to which extent, and like what kind of laws, or what kind of like rules they actually follow to become that compliance. And like, in Abuja and Lagos, like which ones they actually broke, because if you just broke one out of those three, like CBN is like bye-bye, we're going to revoke your license. And then the main gist, I guess, is like, how does it actually look like? That's like, what is the BDC distribution in the country now when you consider the revocation list and the original list. That is, if you subtract and you remove the March 1st list from the original list, that is pre-March 1st, how many BDCs remain in the country and where they're located. That story is the most interesting for this like for you listening, I suppose. I will talk about that, but before I talk about that, like, I just want to emphasize that, like, looking at the regional distribution, that is, if you're asking yourself, like, why is that important to actually look at the Northeast or like the Southwest, like, are you just trying to make this randomly a bit, like political? Well, that's not the intention, because as I've explained, I don't even like the term geopolitical in the first place. I would just prefer that they are called zones, or just zones in Nigeria. But like, it's important to look at it this way for three reasons that I have identified. There are obviously more, but the ones I've identified are three. The first is that, like, properly understanding the regional share of BDCs will allow us to gauge which regions have businesses and residents that require more foreign exchange frequently, based on demand and supply. That is, Lagos State just does not have 2,000 plus BDCs, or did not used to have 2,000 plus BDCs for the sake of it. There are people that required those exchanges. That was why they had so much BDCs. The second reason is that for making this analysis regional, is because the regional distribution also gives us a sense of the difficulty it is for residents to get foreign exchange. That is, if residents in the northeast, as I've explained, would definitely find it harder to exchange their dollars for USD than those in the southwest. So if I'm in Borno State, I'm obviously going to find it harder to change my dollars than if I was in Lagos. If I was in Lagos, give or take, maybe 20 minutes away from a BDC before, right? But if I'm in Borno State, I have to go to the bank because there's actually no BDC in my state, and I have to just be dependent on the bank. If the bank is wasting my time, I have to call my relative perhaps in Abuja, or my relative in Kano to help me change money, which is more cumbersome, and it's just so much friction in the process. And then the final thing is that why I am looking at this regionally is because due to the greater share of revocation in the southwest, the north central, and the northwest, that's the southwest, where Lagos is situated, the north central where Abuja is situated, and the northwest where Kano is situated, right? Banks in those regions will actually experience more businesses and individuals going to them to request for foreign exchange, right? As I've said, one of the reasons I'm seeing the CBN taking all these actions is because they are thinking, first of all, they want to have more control, and they want to be able to determine how much dollars Nigerians have access to, to be able to know how to manage demand and supply, because that also influences inflation. But yeah, so banks in those regions will experience more people coming to them because of the revocations, and I will talk about the revocation, BDCs, how Nigeria looks in terms of BDCs after the March 1st revocation list. But banks just have to do more in this sense, right? But at the same time, banks can only do as much as the guidelines allow them to do. They can't go beyond what CBN says they should do, and we'll be able to figure out how much, if this is true. That is, if more people are going to the banks, by the third quarter, fourth quarter of this year, or even in the 2024 annual reports, that's with the deposits, or in terms of transactions, there are different measures we can use to be able to gauge, did people actually go to banks more, because of, we might not be able to say technically because of the March 1st revocation, but we can be able to make assumptions based on correlations that we might see in the data, right? So if there's an increase in deposits, especially foreign exchange deposits, then we might be able to say, perhaps more businesses now move to banks, right? Because literally they have fewer options available in Nigeria. And of course, there's a possibility that all the revoked BDCs will come back again and get new licenses, either the tier 1 or the tier 2. But whilst that is being done, right, the fact is that 4,000 plus BDCs have their licenses revoked, and in the interim, right, there are just about 1,500 BDCs in the country. And that's what I'm going on to next, which is, what does Nigeria look like now in terms of BDCs when you consider the fact that we have, or the CBN has removed more than 4,000 BDCs in the country, revoked the licenses? Well, the first thing that we see is that there's a huge drop across the nation. So Lagos now only has 743 BDCs, because why I explained that 74% of their BDCs were revoked. The license of 74% of their BDCs were revoked. Abuja only has 211 BDCs now. and Kano State has 375 BDCs. In total, the entire country only has 1,588 BDCs. This is, quite big when you compare to like the previous amount, which was 5,682 BDCs. When you look at it, based on like the regions, the Southwest still has the most BDCs in the country, but it has like fewer compared to the share they had before the revocation list. That is, the Southwest now has only 47.4% of the BDCs in the entire country. If you remember, before the revocation, the Southwest had 52.6%, right? So there's a drop in that sense by like 5%. And what about North Central, where Abuja is? Well, in that case, they only have 13.6%, which is like way less than what they had before, right? So they only have, so the North Central, where Abuja sits, which only accounts for 13.6% of all the BDCs in the country. If you remember, like from the former list, like that's the original list before the revocation, the North Central accounted for 21% of all the BDCs in the country. So that's like a 7% decline, which of course would affect things considerably. And then Northwest, where Kano is situated, actually gained in a way. This is because obviously, like as I've explained, Kano State only had 61% of their BDCs revoked, the licenses of their BDCs revoked, as compared to Abuja, who had 82%, and Lagos State, who had 74%, right? So as a result of that, like there is an increase relatively for the Northwest, and that is like 25.8% of BDCs are now in the Northwest, where Kano is situated. This is actually higher than the past, whereby it only accounted for 18.6% of the BDCs in the country. So when we look at this data, right, we can see that, well, the CBN kind of got what they wanted, which is essentially that, well, they have reduced the number of BDCs in the country, and with this fewer number, I guess they're able to like know more about what is happening all around the country in terms of dollar exchanges, because like the inflation is a big issue for the CBN. I mean, for all Nigerians, but like for the CBN precisely, because it's one of their mandates, like one of their goals is to ensure that inflation is not crazy and skyrocketing. For context, like in February, the food inflation rate was 37.92%, and obviously like food inflation drives a lot of like the headline inflation. That's like the inflation that we actually consider. It drives a lot of it, and like the real inflation in the country, taking into account every other thing, was about 31% in February, according to the National Bureau of Statistics as well. So if you look at inflation data, which is just going up, right, and you look at like CBN actions, there's a parallel in the sense of like, if we have more inflation, the CBN will just do what we might see as a bit more heavier stuff, right? Will bring about more heavier regulations and guidelines that might affect a lot of people instantly. What does this really mean? Well, in the short term, the implication is that the CBN, will move, as I've explained, a lot of businesses and individuals to just rely on banks, right? Or, to rely on banks, or to be first in the line when going to BDCs, essentially. And then this, in the long term, what this might mean is that the CBN is, just has to understand that all the work you're doing, like all the fights and all the regulations that's being done essentially to combat inflation, might not be effective still, because the real problem, right, or the driving problem of inflation in Nigeria is food inflation. And why are food prices increasing? Because, well, we are having less food, right? There's more demand than there is supply of the food, because farmers are not farming. And why can't farmers farm? Because, well, not safe for them to go to their farm. So essentially, we can see that the greatest enemy the CBN has is actually like food. Is actually insecurity that is like across the nation. And honestly, if the CBN wants to actually control FX rates, my opinion is that the best way to do that is to actually pressure the executive arm, to pressure the security forces to essentially ensure that farmers can go back to farm, and they can produce food, as that will drive down food inflation. And if food inflation is driven down, we have seen historically that like Nigeria's inflation also goes down considerably. So that is what the story is saying. At the end of the day, the CBN is trying to do its best to ensure its mandate is kept, that is, inflation is kept, and it has done this again through revocation of BDCs, and because BDCs have been revoked, well, Nigerians might suffer a bit. Nigerians who are depending on BDCs for transactions will suffer a bit more, and banks will have like more customers perhaps, and we'll also see an increase, my assumption is, in like digital transactions, in just like deposits, in the long run, right? But again, the CBN has to consider the fact that whatever guidelines they put out, all of these things, like, you're just trying to put like sellotape on a Russian tap, right? And you need to be able to cement that leakage, or just remove the pipe altogether. And you can only do that when you actually combat insecurity. That is the challenge, in my opinion, because that affects production, productivity, and just farming in the entire country. That's all for this storytelling. I'm actually so exhausted for some reason, but I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope like you actually understand what is happening in this case with the BDCs, and what is happening like in respect to the CBN. Once again, if you want to have like a more visual view of what has happened, there are figures on my LinkedIn page that you can look at. That is on the post, a data story of BDCs in Nigeria. That is all for now, and I hope that, well, if you are dependent on dollars, that it shall be well with you. That shall be well with you, and that you will find alternatives, and hopefully that our banks can actually like help a lot of businesses and individuals in the long run.